thank you. You're very kind. This is the last in this particular series of talks on revolution and governance, and it has to do with the civil war in Spain. And over these talks, we've been discussing different styles of governance, the effect that revolution and disturbance has on the means of governance in various societies. And this will be the concluding talk of a very dramatic time in the 20th century, just before World War II. Before I start, I want to thank the St. Helena Public Library for making these facilities available. I want to thank Megan Jones for making all these arrangements possible. Will Agee for doing a superb job of audio capture and filming of these lectures. We are very grateful, I am very grateful to all of them for this. Thank you. They deserve that applause. The next series will begin in March, on March 8th, and will follow the same pattern every second and fourth Tuesday in March and April, a series of 4 talks on the American Civil War and the key battles that decided that conflict. But there will be an announcement on that, and also there are flyers on that next series of talks at the table at the back of the room. So as you're leaving, you can pick up one of those. La Guerra Civil in Spain in the declining years of the 1930s followed upon a number of centuries of Spanish history that were alternatingly dramatic and torpid. Starting around 1500, Spain enjoyed a golden age, as they called it, that lasted for about a century and a half. And during this time, Spain bestrode the European world, bestrode the whole world. It was the largest empire, the most extensive empire the world had seen since the collapse of Rome 1,000 years before. Because of the discoveries of Columbus and other sailors, navigators, explorers sailing on behalf of Spain, Spain controlled all of the Americas, mostly South America and Mexico, but with claims to North America, other parts of North America, and also had conquered the Philippines. Silver from the Philippines, gold from the Americas flowed back to Spain in an ever-increasing quantity that fueled expansion on the part of the Spanish rulers at that time. They were preeminent in the world, and it was the beginning of European exploration of the rest of the world and a dominance of the so-called Third World by European powers, spurred by the discoveries of Spain. That faded rather quickly, however. A century and a half was the golden age. Following that, Spain gradually declined for the reasons that I've noted here on the screen. They fought numerous wars for God, for their religion, for conquest, and lost many of those efforts finally. Philip II in 1588 sent an armada against Queen Elizabeth of England. Almost all the ships were lost, a complete defeat. Meantime, over the centuries, there was an authoritarian state and church ruling Spain, enforcing almost a feudalistic form of government over the Spanish people that had a deleterious effect on the growth of modernism in Spain. Meantime, especially during the 19th century and the early 20th century, the winds of change were blowing everywhere else in Europe. Industrial change, commercial change, political change, as governments began opening to the bourgeoisie, the middle class, and an expansion of the franchise, but not in Spain. Spain continued to be ruled by the king and the church. And with this decline of empire, which had actually been complete centuries before, there were dreams of lost empire. The Spanish authorities were yearning for those great days under Ferdinand and Philip II, where they bestrode the world, but that was not their situation anymore. This was Spain in 1936. The only foreign territory that Spain could claim was Spanish Morocco, that little bit of blue on the north coast of Africa. And that was a refuge for generals that the Republican government in Madrid did not like, and so would post them to Spanish Morocco, and that was the fate of Francisco Franco when he fell out of favor in the early 30s. At this time, Spain was undergoing great change. The king, King Alfonso XIII, had abdicated in 1931. And what followed was the Republic of Spain, a constitutional form of government, basically with a solid middle class and an enlarged franchise, even though the peasantry, in many cases, were still living in a feudal situation. But as time moved toward the middle 30s, it became increasingly tempestuous, the political situation within Spain. And so there were rumors of a coup. There was rising escalation of rhetoric, both from the right and from the left, for the government, against the government, for communism, against communism, for the church, against the church. It was a case of rising turmoil, really almost anarchy. But each side thought that they could somehow get a grip on it. It was at this point that Franco, a young general, enlisted the support of other generals to take over the government, to mount a coup against the government and return it to traditional church-dominated Spain and repress all these disparate voices that were somehow disturbing the whole political structure. He was exiled, as I say, to Morocco, but he continued his conversations with the other generals on the mainland. And on July 17th, they agreed to mount a coup, an attack under, they call themselves the Nationalists, or the Phalange. They started a coup on July 17th, 1936. It was not thought to be very successful. It was not thought that it would be successful or that it would gain ground very rapidly. But Franco was able to make the move across the Strait of Gibraltar, get on the mainland in force, and pretty soon was moving on the nationalist forces. At the same time, he was getting help from the Axis forces, Germany and Italy, who were eager to join him in this fight. At that time, the Republican government consisted of a president, pretty much a figurehead president. The real power in the government was in the premier, and there were two premiers during the Civil War, and a whole variety, an alphabet soup of leftist parties and leftists generally supporting what was called the Republican government, Los Republicanos. There were traditional labor unions, which were very strong. There were the anarchists. Can you imagine? The anarchists are advocating a position for themselves in government. This is a little irony, but in Spain, they were able to carry two different ideas in their heads at the same time. There was the POUM, P-O-U-M, which is a very leftist, communist-dominated movement, primarily in Barcelona, which, and as I believe you all know, Barcelona and the state within it, which it exists, Catalonia, have always been rebellious and contrary to whatever Madrid wants to do. So the POUM was a communist-dominated political party. The PSOE, Parti Socialisti, easy for someone else to say, was actually the party of the man in power at the time, the premier, Largo Caballero, and the PSOE was a socialist party, as the name indicates. So the structure is one of the nationalists under Franco being very strong-minded, determined, unified, with a very clear focus on what the goals would be, which is to seize power and restore authoritarian Spain, versus the Republican government in Madrid, which was made up of really, the only way to call it is a wild collection of leftist parties, various degrees of leftward leaning, but unable to coordinate almost by the nature of things. They could not get their act together and act in a unified manner. And for 3 years, as their government came under increasing pressure and finally they were defeated, they continued to wrangle among themselves. These are the two premiers. Largo Caballero served for about 18 months, and then Jay Greene came into power in the last 18 months of the Republic. On the other hand, as I say, was Franco, and he cloaked himself in tradition, in the church, and there were monarchists who were looking for the reestablishment of the monarchy, the restoration of the Bourbon line. There were the generals, army officers, and the Guardia Civil, the police, the national police, who were ranging on the side of Franco, and there was also the church. And the church was claiming in a publication widely circulated in 1936 that they were fighting against the Judeo-Marxists and the Masons. They were the bad guys that were threatening Spain, and the church and Franco were going to rescue Spain from them. Also at the same time in Europe, this is 1936 and the last few years of the 30s. As we know, both Mussolini and Hitler had come to power. Mussolini in 1919 or 1920, Hitler in 1933. By the early 30s, they had formed themselves into the Berlin-Rome axis, and we see them here strutting on parade in this picture on the left. Opposite them, supposedly, was the figure of Joseph Stalin ruling the Soviet Union, the Russian Empire. And at that time, we're talking 1936 again, Stalin was the hero of working class peoples everywhere. In the view of the left in Europe and in America, communism had succeeded in Russia, not merely taken over, succeeded, and was the true voice of the working man, opposed to these Axis powers who were oppressing the poor and the working classes everywhere. Elsewhere in Europe, we had the powers that had been successful in the First World War, England and France, and they were rife with appeasement at this time. The picture below here is that of Neville Chamberlain and Edouard Daladier of France in 1938 shaking hands with Hitler in the disgraceful Munich Agreement that betrayed Czechoslovakia. So these forces were surrounding and on the same stage with Spain in the mid-30s, with all this ferment going on as between fascism, communism, the role of the middle class, liberal democracy versus communism versus fascism. And both the Axis powers, Mussolini and Hitler, and Stalin, on the other hand, meddled, went feet first right into Spain, aiding the people they thought were their friends. So immediately, Hitler and Mussolini rallied to Franco and supplied the nationalists with tanks, with sophisticated weapons, machine guns, field artillery, ammunition, uniforms, and men. Armed men in units, and also the leadership, officers and generals who would give the nationalist forces a lot of advice and lead in a number of actions. Stalin also, I'm getting my keys mixed up here. Stalin also furnished arms and tanks and weapons to the Republican forces, but as we will discuss in a little bit, with a much more sinister motive behind. But as the war broke out, the Civil War broke out in July of 1936, it was clearly a fascist fight against the popular forces backed by the Soviet Union, with England and France adopting a posture of appeasement and not willing to lift their hand to do anything to aid any party in Spain. The first fight of the war was in August, and there was and is still, because it's been restored, a gorgeous, almost Moorish castle called the Alcazar on a hill in Toledo. And this was held by the nationalists and came under siege by the Republican government. And they soon, as you can see in these pictures, reduced it to rubble within a short time. There were many people rallying to the Republican side, and I've entitled this page, Las Mujeres Libres, for truly women were being liberated in terms of their roles within the leftist Spanish cadres. Women were very active in all of these roles, including fighting roles. As you can see here, there's a picture on the left of a woman taking training with a rifle, and on the right, women on the barricades fighting against the nationalist forces. And in the middle was a remarkable character, La Pasionaria. This woman was a somewhat stout, middle-aged woman, unprepossessing in appearance. But when she began to speak, she aroused her audience, her Republican audience of whatever, whether they were bourgeois, whether they were working class, they were absolutely aroused. She was a great orator. And almost from the beginning, as we'll see shortly, Madrid, the capital city, was almost surrounded by the nationalist forces. And La Pasionaria said, "No pasarán," they shall not pass. And for 3 years they did not. The nationalists were held off, and Madrid continued to exist as the capital city almost for the entire length of the war. But these three illustrations show the effect that women were having in this new age that was dawning in Spain. These are some street scenes from throughout the war, and you'll notice particularly in the bottom picture, there's a man in obviously a bourgeois in his dark coat and his bowler hat, and he's got a rifle and he's on the barricades. The woman on the upper left is standing amidst the rubble of her home. This was a devastating war on all sides. And the motivating force on both sides was passion. The adherents of the nationalists, the adherents of the Republicans were passionate for their cause. And mere loss of life meant nothing if one could win the ultimate victory. And this was true of the right, this was true of the left, and was the reason why this was such a terrible war for Spain. Millions died in this fight for Spain in the late 30s of the 20th century. An unfortunate thing happened very early on, as I say. Madrid was almost surrounded by the nationalists. The nationalist forces had moved very rapidly and captured about half of Spain and were on the outskirts of Madrid. The Spanish government, the Republican government, the seat of the government was Madrid, and the gold supply was held in the banks there. So, urged by the Russians, they managed to ship all the gold via ships out of Valencia, Mediterranean port, and over to Moscow, where the gold was going to be held in safekeeping, as Stalin said, for the duration. And Stalin and his henchmen were very careful accountants. So every bit of arms, of men, of munitions that went to the Republican forces were very carefully noted down in a ledger, almost a ledger. And deductions were made from this gold supply. The gold supply lasted about 18 months under the secure accounting of the Moscow authorities. Thereafter, there were some loans and some further advances, but in effect, the entire Spanish gold moved from Madrid to Moscow, and not a dime of it came back. That happened very early in the war. And you can see here that by December of 1936, only 5 months after the war started, the nationalist forces controlled more than half of Spain, with a little bit of blue up there in the Basque country around Bilbao. But it was a dire situation. And starting in late 1936, early 1937, foreigners began flocking to Spain, mostly leftists. There were the rightists and the fascists from Germany and Italy officially being sent by their governments to help. But leftists of every stripe were flooding into Spain to help in this righteous cause against the fascist forces. And we have this unique situation surrounding the Hotel Florida in Madrid, in which a number of the journalists and the notables that came from every country, from England, from France, from Germany, left-wingers from Germany, from Italy, even Russia, if they could get out of the country, flocked to Madrid. Americans came. And here was this hotel sitting virtually on the front line in Madrid, often under shelling. Artillery shells went through this hotel all the time. If you're going to Madrid these days, you will not find the Hotel Florida. It has been since torn down. But it was the headquarters for all the journalists and the leading people, the celebrities that were flocking to Spain, including Antoine de Exupéry, the famous aviator and writer, John dos Passos, famous American author at the time, André Malraux, the Frenchman who later served de Gaulle so loyally both during the war and after. Gellhorn and Hemingway, and there's a marvelous movie by that name, Gellhorn and Hemingway. And I really recommend it if you haven't seen it. It gives, I think, a very accurate picture of what life in Madrid was like in 37 and 38 among this privileged class, this glamorous class of foreigners that were flocking to Spain. Hemingway was married at the time. Pauline, his wife, was back in Key West and writing him letters constantly, and he went traipsing off to Spain, and Gellhorn followed him. She was a glamorous, beautiful woman, younger than Hemingway, and she set her cap for Ernest and landed the boy in the Hotel Florida. There was also this famous photographer, became famous photographer because of Spain, Robert Capa, and his German girlfriend, Gerda Taro. And she was an aspiring photographer. He was from Hungary originally, but she got him to change his name to something that would be a little more usable in the West. And the two of them hung out again with these other celebrities and were constantly driving to the front. The front was right outside of Madrid. So you could grab a ride from somebody, maybe a taxi driver if he was willing to go. And within a few minutes, you could be witnessing fighting that was going on. So Hemingway and Capa and Dos Passos and all the rest went out to the front almost every day, taking notes, taking pictures, and then gathering in the evening at the Hotel Florida, drinking copious amounts of vino and beer, and evenings and nights full of conversation, lovemaking, and a number of other thoroughly satisfactory activities. It was so glamorous. It was passionate. It was glamorous. There was a tension in the air that you could be killed at any minute. An artillery shell coming through the hotel on one of these visits to the front. But that tension, that sense of exhilaration of being on the front lines and in this righteous cause seemed to fill the air. It was an exciting time. There were also the international fighters who came, and they were gathered under what was called the International Brigade, Brigada Internacional, that was formed. And these were men who came to fight literally again from all over the world, Englishmen, Frenchmen, Foreign Legion fellows from Africa, left-wing Germans, left-wing Italians, Russians, again, if they could escape, other than the Red Army soldiers who were coming over in great numbers, Americans. The Abraham Lincoln Battalion was a very famous unit which fought in that war very bravely. 10,000 never came home from the international brigades. And for a while there, especially in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, the survivors who did come home to America, in the latter part of the 30s and well into the 40s, they were heroes. These are the men who had put their lives on the line to save Republican Spain and to fight the fascists. But when we went through this paroxysm of anti-communism starting in the 50s under McCarthy and others, pretty soon Abraham Lincoln Brigade membership was not the sort of thing that you talked about, and many of these fellows were called up before congressional committees. It was a real change of events, a change in their lives dramatically. But this was another example of the passion that gripped so many people who saw Spain under siege and likely to fall under the hands of the Franco nationalists if something was not done. There are iconic images that survive from that time. This is a photograph by Robert Capa called The Falling Soldier. And he snapped the shutter milliseconds after a sniper bullet shot this soldier. Dramatic photograph, I'm sure you've seen it many times. There's another dramatic, iconic image, and that is the painting Guerra by Picasso. And the story here is that there was going to be, and there was eventually held, an international exposition in Paris in May of 1937. And Picasso was commissioned to do a work for this exposition. He was puzzling what he was going to do exactly. And then in early April, in a little market town in the Basque country of Spain called Guernica, on market day, on a Monday afternoon, starting around 4 o'clock, German bombers came over, the Condor Legion, as it was called. These were the bombers and the pilots that Hitler had loaned to Franco. The Condor Legion flew over and for 2 hours, from 4 o'clock until 6 o'clock, bombed this defenseless town, killing 2,000 people, wounding an equal number of people, devastating the town for absolutely no reason. This town had no strategic value. But what was happening was that in addition to the altruism, if you want to call it that, of aiding a fellow fascist, Hitler and Mussolini aiding Franco, Hitler and Mussolini were rehearsing for World War II. Hitler had been rearming Germany. The Italians had been arming, contrary to League of Nations strictures, and they wanted to practice. They wanted to put these weapons to use and see how they worked, and not only the weapons, but the tactics, and to plan, and here was a gorgeous opportunity to rehearse for the war that Hitler was planning. Let's be very clear that Stalin saw this war in the very same terms. He knew eventually he would be fighting Hitler. He knew that because Hitler had said so in Mein Kampf. In 1923, Hitler had written his book, and he said, the Germans need living room, Lebensraum, and we're going to march east and we're going to dominate those inferior peoples, the Slavs. So Stalin and Hitler and Mussolini were practicing World War II. Guernica was simply the most blatant, awful, disastrous example of that thinking. This happened in early April, as I say, and Picasso had his inspiration. And Guernica, ever since, has been so iconic and symbolic of the chaos and the brutal suffering of modern war. Here's an example of the propaganda. There was propaganda on both sides, but when you think back, in World War I, there was a slight use of propaganda, mostly in the recruiting posters of the time, and certainly some dramatic visioning of what the German occupation forces were doing in Belgium in World War I. But this really came to flourish in Spain in 1936 to 39. These are all propaganda posters from the left, obviously. You can see the hammer and sickle in one of them. But they're very dramatic, very colorful. They really hit the viewer hard. Franco, for his part, did a little bit less propaganda, and this is a piece idealizing him and showing him as a beneficent uncle, as it were, with all his flags and banners in the background. The other is from a book with almost no attribution. It was drawings that were put together from various painters during the war, and this is just called, I believe, A Young Soldier. And it also is an idealized view of the young recruit for the Republican side, with his banner, with his bandana and his rifle slung over his shoulder, and a look of resolute defiance on his face. Another young man who went to Spain was George Orwell, except that's his pen name. But under that name, he wrote a wonderful book, which I highly recommend, and I've got it on my reading list at the end of the lecture, called Homage to Catalonia. Catalonia being again that state in which Barcelona was the capital. And he was in Barcelona with PUM, Parti Obrero de Unificación Marxista. These were the really hardcore Marxists, later infiltrated by the communists, and later, after that, infiltrated by the Stalinists, who began to wreak havoc among other leftists who they thought were not towing the Moscow line. And all of this is detailed by Orwell in his Homage to Catalonia. And he was one of the leftists who was really ripped up by this war. And what he saw in terms of the cynicism of the Stalinists and what they were doing to other leftists, outright assassination of supposedly their fellow combatants against the fascists. It was extraordinary. All of this going on in Barcelona in that desperate period of 1937 and 1938. This is an example of the Junker bombers that Hitler supplied to the nationalist forces. Machine guns, field artillery, bombs, airplanes, crews for the airplanes, officers, the entire panoply of a modern army's equipment was sent to Spain by both Mussolini and Hitler. Mussolini supplied really a whole army, at least several divisions, whereas Hitler supplied mostly air crews and airplanes. But both the bombers and Hitler was testing the Messerschmitt fighters and dive bombers also in this war. So it quickly escalated from its raw beginnings in '36. There was a young man sent from Russia by Stalin. His name was Tukhachevsky. He was a young army officer. And he, like Charles de Gaulle in France at the time, were both arguing for an improved use of tanks and infantry. When tanks were first developed in the First World War, it was thought that this solid piece of tracked machinery would simply roll over the trenches, flatten the barbed wire, and then the rest of the army could follow behind and march through. Tukhachevsky and de Gaulle said, no, that's not the way modern tanks should be employed. There should be an intimate association between infantry and the tankers so that they move together as a unit in taking an objective or conducting an offensive. Tukhachevsky, for some reason, fell afoul of Stalin and was called back to Moscow in 1937 and accused of treasonous activity, put on trial and shot. And this was the beginning of the purges that Stalin initiated against his army officers. So that by 1939, when Stalin wrote the Stalin-Hitler Pact, which divided up Poland, and later, 2 years later, when Hitler invaded Russia, the Russian army had been decapitated. Its major officers had all been shot on the basis that they were disloyal to Stalin. What Stalin was doing was cleaning out all the people he thought could possibly be his rivals. But he rather stupidly decapitated the Red Army, and Tukhachevsky, this brilliant man who had been very successful in Spain, fell afoul of that. What happened, the direct result of that in Spain was that what Tukhachevsky had been teaching in the way of combined operations of tanks and infantry moving together fell into disfavor. I mean, after all, if the fellow who's saying this is a good way gets hauled back to Russia and is killed for his pains, you quickly lose your appetite for advocating combined operations. That, of course, had a very direct effect on the success of the Republican forces. One of the big fights was for Jarama and Guadalajara in 1937, and this was going to be a combined thrust that would cross the Jarama River from the south and attack behind Madrid, and the Italian forces, the several divisions that Mussolini had sent, were going to attack from the north. Both of them were to get behind Madrid and combine, cut Madrid off, and end the war. The Republicans didn't, the nationalists, the Italians, didn't start fast enough. And the result was that the fight took place on the Jarama River first, later on the Guadalajara front. And because of that misstep, the Republicans were able to defeat the nationalists on both fronts and saved Madrid for the time. That was one example of a Republican victory, a Republican success. But you can see that at this time, which I think is October of 37, more than half of Spain has fallen to the nationalists. Madrid is still there on the front line. Barcelona is still there. Teruel is still in Republican hands, but they are definitely being hard pressed. And in the Basque country, all the Basques who were completely Republican in their feelings, all the Basques have been defeated, and it's entirely nationalist. The perimeter was shrinking, there's no doubt about it. But still the Republicans fought on. There was a battle for Teruel, which is a city lying between Barcelona and Madrid. That went on for a long time, many weeks. Finally, the city fell, and the result was that the nationalist forces punched through to the sea, and so isolated Barcelona and isolated the Republican forces to the south. This was not looking good for the Republicans, but as I say, they continued to fight on. The Republican government moved from Madrid, evacuated to Valencia, but you can see there that Valencia, while it's on the coast and has access if one had to flee, still it was very close to the front lines. But they continued to fight on. There was another fight later, and this was the Battle of the Ebro, a river southwest of Barcelona, east of Madrid. And that went on for 5 months. And you can see from the casualty figures there, the losses were immense on both sides. But the Republicans lost even more heavily than did the nationalists, and less able to withstand these losses. So the fighting was very bitter, and again, as I say, the thread that runs through all this is the passion and the zealotry for one's cause. The nationalists took no prisoners. If they surrounded and captured, or if Republican elements surrendered to them, they were marched off and shot. The Republican forces, for their part, were not a whole lot more considerate of prisoners, but there was somewhat less slaughter on that side. But the feelings ran very deep. The hatreds were high. The passion was very high in this conflict. I think this picture is so eloquent. If you look at that man's face, a picture taken late in the war, to me, there's resolution in that face, but there is also fatalism. It's almost as if he knows he's in a perilous position, but he's going to fight on. This, incidentally, was the Republican salute. The clenched fist of the worker, not this effeminate salute that the Western nations gave with fingers extended, but the clenched fist of the worker, that was the salute of the Republican forces in the war. Very soon, Barcelona fell, and it was just 1/4 of the Spanish peninsula now in Republican hands, still including Madrid. No Pasaran And it was true. They did not pass, at least until the very end. But it was clear that the perimeter was constricting very, very rapidly. A number of people tried to get out via Valencia as they could, through Barcelona before Barcelona fell, if they could. And it was at this time in 38, late 38, early 39, that all these celebrity journalists and celebrity Americans and Brits and French abandoned Spain. They were not going to get caught in this chaos, for it was chaos. It was bombings from the air, artillery shellings into this narrowing perimeter all the time. Capa got out, he was able to flee. Hemingway got out, and Gellhorn separately, Dos Passos made it out. Gerda Taro, Capa's lover, did not make it, sadly, regrettably. She was on a convoy. Capa had gotten out a few days earlier, and she was in a convoy that was heading out and going to get to Valencia and make it to safety. However, there was no room in the vehicle, so she was riding on the outboard, running board, and a narrow road, and of course a great big tank came down the road in the opposite direction, and she was a goner. One of the great tragedies. She was a beautiful and accomplished woman, every bit as good a photographer as Capa, and one of the great love stories that came out of this awful war. So this was the situation in late 38, early 39, with the Franco forces aided by the fascists clearly winning the war. By April 1st, it was all over. And Madrid had been captured, Valencia had been captured, and Spain now was entirely in Franco's hands. And in early April, there was this gigantic parade through Madrid with a very proud Franco basking in the glory of the nationalist win. And as I say, the Germans and the Italians and the Russians were highly satisfied with the performance that they had put on, because they had had a chance to test weaponry, test strategy, test tactics for the war they knew that was coming, the war that Hitler knew he was plotting to advance. In defense of Franco, there were two things that he did that, in effect, saved Spain. In the first place, as soon as he had won in 1939, and that was in, as we saw, April 1st of 39, the war in Europe, World War II, started September 1st, just a few months later, 5 months later, with Hitler and Stalin attacking Poland. Hitler and Mussolini were leaning on Franco, come join us, become part of the Axis. And all of us fascists will hang together and we'll win the war. Franco would not go along with that. He was a very cagey fellow, and he sort of put them off. He dilly-dallied with them, but he would not finally sign the paper that would align Spain with the other fascist countries. The second thing that he did was, prior to his death in 1975, he set the wheels in motion so that when he died, he would be succeeded by a constitutional monarch who became Juan Carlos in 1975. And so, yes, monarchy was reestablished, but it was a constitutional monarchy, and Franco had brought it about. Now, this is quite a change for this man who had instituted the coup against the Republicans on the basis that he wanted to restore absolute monarchy, authoritarianism, and the position of the church. But by 1975, he had seen at least slightly the light and was willing to make these changes that, in effect, ushered Spain into the modern world. So Spain, that had bestrode the world 450, almost 500 years earlier with its great successes, was now finally back into Europe. And when the European community was formed, I believe it was 1992, Spain was one of the first members. And Spain has had some financial problems since, but is firmly now in the modern world, and that would not have come about had not Franco made those very bold moves. Here is a reading list that I offer to you. A lot of very interesting reading about this dramatic, tragic struggle that occurred in Spain in the first third of the 20th century. So I thank you for your attention on this, and if there are any questions, let's get to them. Thank you. The question is about the abdication of Alfonso, and why did he leave, and what were the pressures on him? Is that the question as I understand it? Alfonso was an aging monarch, and there were a number of pressures from both the middle class and this collection of leftist forces that were pleading, urging that Spain join the rest of Europe and come into the modern world. And Alfonso finally was not able to prevail, and he abdicated and fled the country. I've forgotten, I think he ended up in Rome or on the French Riviera with a sizable bank account, and lived out his years quite peacefully, but he was clearly pushed out of office by the liberal forces who wanted Spain to have a more modern form of government. Homage to Catalonia. It's not the whole story, but it's so well written, and it puts you into the picture of all these different forces that were fighting each other. Internecine war on the left, the forces of the Stalinists and the fascists. Also, the Hotel Florida is a fantastic story. It's a brilliantly written book about all these celebrities coming to Spain, journalists, celebrities, to write about and to witness this struggle. Hugh Thomas's book on the history of Spain is a mammoth work. The book is this thick. It's really almost for the scholar or the student of Spanish history, but it is marvelously rewarding. And of course, there's For Whom the Bell Tolls by Hemingway, his story of an American named Robert and his lover Maria in the mountains, and he's been sent there to set off explosives and blow a bridge. And the story just takes place over a few days, relatively. But it's one of Hemingway's best works, and I don't often recommend novels when I'm giving these historic talks, but you really have to read For Whom the Bell Tolls, because it's fiction that from a noted American author who was revered at the time and later, and also puts you in the picture, as does Homage to Catalonia, as to what the Spanish Civil War was all about. There is, and it's complicated, but I'm happy to go into it if all of you have patience. There were two wings of the Bourbon family. There were the Bourbons who ruled France, and the last of them were the successors who didn't last long for Louis XVI, as we discussed under the French Revolution. There was the Spanish Bourbon wing also, And that was Alfonso. Alfonso was the last of the Spanish Bourbon. And so there was that. And where it ties further into history, and I don't want to get too deep into this because it's a whole nother story, but in the early 1800s, Napoleon put his brother on the throne of Spain to ensure that that country would be loyal to Napoleon. And that effort began the Spanish Peninsular War, where Wellington and the British Army, together with Spanish people opposed to Napoleon and the French, fought a bitter, bitter war lasting about 4 years from 1808 to 1812, and was, I didn't mention it earlier, but was one of those things that ripped at Spain in the early 19th century. And the survivor of that we have today is the word guerrilla, Guerilla, which in Spanish means guerrilla, small war, and has been applied by us, of course, for any irregular action against regular troops. But that's the confusion of the French Bourbons and the Spanish Bourbons. That's a very good question. Both Dos Passos and Hemingway, Gellhorn, were all prominent going back and forth between Spain and America in an effort to raise money for the Republican government in the late 30s. As the Spanish Civil War ended in defeat and World War II loomed, all of them, Dos Passos and Hemingway and Gellhorn, became involved as journalists in the Second World War. They were generally perceived well during the Spanish Civil War and later, certainly by the left in America. The bankers and the financiers and the Republican Party in the United States did not look favorably upon them, of course. But they went on each to have very rich careers. And Gellhorn was the last to survive of all of them, and I believe she was involved. She was doing journalism in the Vietnam War. So that woman saw a lot of fighting over her very eventful life. Dos Passos and Hemingway had a terrible falling out, prompted by Hemingway, who became quite brutish and miserable toward Dos Passos, who had been his great friend earlier in the 30s. But Hemingway accused Dos Passos of not being a true communist. Ernest thought of himself as a true communist in 1938, something that probably a few years later he would not advocate as vehemently. But they had checkered careers, to answer your question, after the war. Yeah, the question is to discuss a little more fully the role of the church during the Spanish Civil War. That in itself is a small volume of the relations as among the nationalist forces, the church, which was very much allied with them, certainly at the higher levels of the church, not necessarily the village priests and the nuns, and the Republican forces. The church hierarchy was clearly in favor of Franco and the nationalists because of the high position the church had occupied in Spain prior to the Civil War. There were accusations made by the nationalists and by others that the Republican forces exercised terrible depredations against individual priests and nuns. And a lot of the nationalist propaganda was to the effect that the Republican forces were massacring nuns and priests wholesale wherever they were in control or took over territory. This is grossly exaggerated. It's been shown since to be a sheer propaganda, but there's no question but that there was a great anti-clerical feeling on the part of the common man, the common worker, the common peasant in the field against the church in general, because the church had occupied such an authoritarian position in Spanish society, and the church was seen as every bit as malevolent as was the monarchy in the 19th century and into the 20th century. But there was just a gross exaggeration of the killings. There were some, there's no question about it, but they were in the hundreds, not the tens of thousands that the Franco government claimed. But I believe, I think it's true to say today that there is still a ambivalence within Spain in the position the church holds and the view of individual Spaniards toward the church. Some, of course, are very devout. Others want nothing to do with clericism. So it's a very tangled story of the church and Spain over the years. Parallels can be drawn, but as in trying to compare any two periods in history, sometimes the parallels are not quite apt. There are reasons to be concerned, there's no question about that, in terms of the rhetoric coming from the right, rhetoric if not actual actions in this country. That happens to be my view. But I do not view it as seriously as one would if one were a citizen of Madrid in July of 1936. We are nowhere near that. Again, I stress that when you're talking in these areas, one's views are obviously very personal, very individual, and I claim no greater correctness than anyone else does with regard to these things. But whenever we get into a situation where things are looking very bad for the United States, whether the complaint is coming from the right or coming from the left or coming from the middle, I am reminded of a remark attributed to Otto von Bismarck, the great chancellor of Germany, back in the 1880s and 1890s. And he said, "There is a special providence that looks out for drunkards, fools, and the United States of America." And when you think about it, that's true. I mean, we have been a fortunate country. My Lord, the scrapes that we've gotten ourselves into and then miraculously gotten out of. Vietnam, good Lord. In 1970 and 1975, people were saying this is the worst possible thing that could have happened. This is the first genuine American defeat. It was, no question about it. This is the end of democracy in our country as we know it, because the right-wing generals are going to take over the place. Never happened. So somehow we scrape by. I would say American history, that's the only area in which I would concede that American history is unique. Well, yes, the question is if and perhaps all of you did hear it, that this lady remembers her history teacher saying that Franco, as criticized as he may be, brought Spain from the 16th century to the 19th century. And that's generally true, and I think that's one of the points I've been trying to make, that certainly in his later years, he made up for a lot of the evil that he did as a younger man in opposing the Republican forces. But there's no question that Spain today, and thanks to its joining the common market, is no longer the outlawed or forlorn nephew of the rest of Europe. Spain is fully engaged commercially, intellectually, with modern Europe. And that would not have happened but for Franco in his last years. And yes, for most of his rule, remember, he came to power finally on April 1st, 1939, and well into the 50s and 60s, and almost into the 70s, he was an authoritarian ruler. He was a dictator. And the church was back in power with all the force on Spanish life that had meant before the Civil War. So even at that time, in the 60s and 50s and the 60s, and yes, Franco did allow bases, our bases in Spain, and some of those bases are still there, because we were now opposing communism, and that was his great fear, was communism. So yes, he brought Spain into the 19th century from the 16th, and because of his later steps, he finally brought it into the 20th century. That's a very good question. I don't know. Now, the Spanish government since has worked very hard haranguing the British and making moves against Gibraltar, and the British simply won't give it up. The British won Gibraltar by some settlement in the 18th century of one of the many wars that they were all carrying on in those days, and got the Rock as a base, and the British are not at all of a mind to give it up. And of course, the Spanish are, I think, rightfully claiming that this is Spanish territory, and but for some peace settlement in the 18th century, it would be theirs. But that's an ongoing conflict. I don't know if Franco made an effort to get it back. Thank you very much.